Good Game is the show for gamers, by gamers.
This week, we're going back in time to when the net referred to a piece of equipment used by fisherfolk.
To when Sega still made hardware, and console wars meant daggers at dawn for rabid Sony and Nintendo fanboys.
And to a time when some of the best brains to ever work in game design were making the very best games of their careers.
That's right, gamers. This week, Good Game pings the 90s.
Welcome to this very special show as we revisit the 1990s. It was a time of massive technological advances that changed forever the games we play.
And it's when Badge and I really began our serious love affair for games.
That's true. For me, it was Quake. But first, can you guess the game for this week? Come on, that was in.
Badge. Quake.
Okay. Well, the good thing about pinging the 90s is we get to choose a game from that decade to review. And it was a really hard choice. So many brilliant games. But after much pontificating, hand-wringing, palm reading and bedwetting, and getting Rock and Roll Racing knocked back,
shred jams in the first.
I'm going with Quake.
Good choice.
Good game.
First-person shooters really made their mark in the 90s, and there were some big milestones such as Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, of course, but the one which had the most impact was undoubtedly Quake.
Designed by John Romero and programmed by a fierce gaming team, including legendary rocket scientist John Carmack, Quake did what all other shooters wanted to do, and it did it in true 3D.
The single-player campaign was split into 4 episodes, accessible by slipgates, which is fancy talk for teleporters. id, of course, made Doom, and the gameplay was very similar, dodging lots of enemies, collecting pass cards, and getting to the exit alive. The chilling groans of enemies and the spooky atmosphere was enough to scare the pants off any gamer, but not without soiling them first.
Secrets were everywhere, and as a byproduct, rocket jumping was invented. Usually, if you came across a tasty pickup or a key without anything guarding it, chances are, upon collection, all hell would break loose and waves of abominable creatures would come at you.
That is, unless they got in their own crossfire first, in which case you just sit back and watch the carnage. It really was an overwhelming and unrelenting game. It was really hard at times.
Yes, but thankfully you could save at any time, which made gamers very familiar with the F2 key.
It was definitely the game that had the most impact on the gaming community, and this was because it was online right from the start. The multiplayer maps were just fantastic, and the gameplay was super fast, something that the series still retains to this day. And every Quaker remembers going underwater and letting loose with that lightning gun. Personally, it was my game of choice for the 90s. Every day after school, my friends and I would go up to the computer labs and just start jibbing. I still feel sorry for everyone who was trying to study up there while we dragged the computer's network to a halt at 3:05 p.m. every day until we got caught.
What happened to you?
Well, not much really. I mean, they took it off the servers, but I think they were more impressed with our networking skills.
Yeah, I mean, it was a LAN staple, wasn't it? You just did not go to a LAN without Quake on your machine. And if you didn't have a good enough video card, you were shunned and shamed because you couldn't show it in its finest form, OpenGL.
And it was such a moddable game. There were so many custom maps and mods, including Team Fortress. Quake also popularized bunny hopping and speed running. It was a landmark game, and 9.5 out of 10 from me.
Yep, same score here from me, Badge. The only other thing it needed was some storytelling. How cheesy were those cutscenes at the end of a level?
I don't think I've ever finished reading one.
Good game.
When a decade kicks off with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, sees the launch of the very first PlayStation, and closes with PC classic Half-Life, you know it's been a big one. But just how big were the 90s for gamers? Armed with a scrunchie, I took a trip down memory lane with 90s gurus Seamus Fern and Rowan Tulloch to find out.
The first major event that influenced gaming in the 90s in 1991 was the first Gulf War. The constant video footage we got in those days of smart bombs and bombs that could go down air vents, this meant a huge explosion of the popularity of flight simulator games, and they tried to mirror these kind of images you'd see on the news in the games themselves. The other thing that happened was the Columbine School Massacre in 1999 really affected how mainstream news and mainstream media looked at gaming. The two school students who shot their classmates were both big Doom fans, and they'd made their own levels of Doom. There was a lot of panic around the idea that they'd use Doom as a kind of training simulation.
Violent games will make kids violent. That probably first emerged in the 90s. Games started to get more graphical, and so the reality of the look of a game started to make a big difference.
A game like Night Trap in the early 90s for Sega CD caused a lot of concern with its plotline of home invasion and graphic violence. A game like Phantasmagoria, which signalled a real shift to an adult market.
Did the 90s resurrect any genres that died out in the 80s?
In the 80s, the games industry kind of burnt itself by assuming it would make a fortune from a E.T. tie-in. It went disastrously for them. They had to fill landfills with the cartridges and almost killed off the video game industry. In the 90s, the industry started to warm up again to the idea of movie tie-ins. Some of the best games from the 90s, like GoldenEye, made a fortune.
Remember in the 80s, the only kind of reference that we really got in the movies was the horrible Power Glove kind of promotional movie.
My Power Glove. I love it.
It was pure marketing kind of pap, really. And then in the 90s, we actually started to get, cult filmmakers coming through who played games, and that was part of their mix of what they did, and they started to put that into their movies. So, we had the guys from Swingers, which at the start they're just sitting around playing ice hockey video games. These kinds of things started to push into, the way people were presenting games.
And of course, in the 90s, you also had the growing genre of games turned into films. So you had Super Mario Brothers as a film. You had Wing Commander, which was actually directed by the original programmer of Wing Commander.
How important was Lara Croft in the 90s?
Lara Croft became hugely important. She was the first kind of celebrity from gaming that transcended a game genre. So people like Jermaine Greer kind of weighed into the debate, first of all saying that she was a positive role model, but then sort of changing that to really starting to critique the body image that she presented to young gamers.
One of the biggest things with the 90s would have been CD-ROM, arriving and suddenly creating that opportunity for this multimedia crossover, so multimedia, obviously one of those great buzzwords of the era.
The 90s saw the shift from 2D graphics to 3D graphics. How did that impact on the gaming world?
The shift in 2D to 3D graphics changed a number of things in gaming. It changed the kind of genres that were popular, so that's where the first-person shooter came from.
I think the internet, really did change the way people even thought about their games. I guess a lot of things that once upon a time, you could only get from your, monthly magazine sort of Bible of gaming. Suddenly there were real communities that started to build around specific games. And then also in the 90s, we had the birth of the idea of massively multiplayer. By the end of the decade, Ultima Online and EverQuest had launched, and the rest is history in that sense.
So what were some of the major failures of the 90s?
Some of the genres that did disappear in the 90s that were massive at the time were adventure games. Classics like Monkey Island and Sam & Max. Games like Myst, which were at the time seen to be wild commercial successes that completely crossed over into the mainstream. Yet somehow, off the back of that genre never worked out what to do next. Well, the death of the arcade was a big thing in the 1990s. The idea that we could now bring so much more of that power into our homes meant arcades weren't quite sure what to do with themselves.
So what do gamers today have to thank the 90s for?
Gamers today have a lot to thank the 90s for. A lot of the popular genres that we're still playing these days started off in the 90s. Multiplayer gaming was really born in the 90s with the growth of the internet. Massive multiplayer games, any World of Warcraft players, Ultima Online started up in 1997, and it was that model that has informed all massive multiplayer games since then. So there's a lot coming from the 90s that are still dominating how we play games and how we understand gaming.
If you're a boxer, you might think it's a good idea to eat lightning and excrete thunder. This game, on the other hand, it was just crap. The Legend of Success Joe came out in 1991, both in arcades and for the Neo Geo AES console. And it was based on a popular Japanese comic entitled Tomorrow's Joe. It told the tale of an amateur pugilist punching his way to be the grand champion. But the problem was that the gameplay itself didn't have any chin. The graphics were uglier than a pulped boxer's mush, the animations were knocked out cold, and the controls in particular were so frustrating that they did actually make you want to punch things. Not to mention the game's difficulty scale meant that after just a few fights, it got so hard it was barely worth trying anymore. It's one of the worst games of the 90s, and we still don't know what they were thinking.
Good game.
That's a complete and utter bold-faced lie.
You know it's true. Graphic superiority or not, it doesn't even have any games for it yet.
Well, at least mine doesn't shoot out spider eggs when it overheats.
Face it, my console is superior. Therefore, I am superior, and you're the biggest idiot on the face of the planet.
Wait a sec. Deja vu. I think we've been through this before. In the 90s or something.
Face it, my console is more bodacious. Therefore, I am wicked righteous. And you're the most radical dude on the face of the planet. Not.
I know you are, but what am I? Your argument hasn't changed in over 10 years. I win by default. No! My hands are aflamed and it can't be good for my lungs.
Good game.
Right, my choice of review now.
No prizes for guessing which masterpiece you've gone with, John.
Damn right. When the Nintendo 64 was released, we were all shown what 3D gaming should be like with Super Mario 64. But legendary game designer Shigeru Miyamoto was holding back his true masterpiece, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time.
Its story goes into a bit more detail about the legendary Triforce and how it came to be. Ganondorf is at it again, seizing total power through strength, deception, and the third part of the Triforce, that is power.
You'll learn the basics in your forest village, and at first it kind of bothered me that the game doesn't have a jump button badge, but you don't really need one. If you run off a ledge, it'll automatically jump. The game basically knows when you want to jump, so it's all good.
You'll also be introduced to a new targeting system. Pressing Z at the bottom of the controller automatically locks on to an object of interest or an enemy, and it's as simple as releasing Z to deselect, and in my opinion, this is what makes 3D combat work.
From the beginning, you'll be exposed to some of the best music in a game ever, and that's probably the most memorable thing about this game. It is nostalgia, but it's also something more. It's like when you hear that forest song all these years later, it brings back not only a great experience, but also a kind of respect for the game makers.
I think it's because Ocarina gives you some ownership over that music. The tunes you'll hear in the background throughout the game, you'll actually be able to command on your Ocarina at pivotal points in the game. You can play an area's theme tune to teleport to it, or a person's to speak with them.
Listen.
The magical melodies are heavily involved in puzzle solving as well.
As great as the music and the combat are, I think the most powerful thing this game did right was the way it brought the genre into 3D. You don't just have to think about what's around you in this game, you have to think vertically as well. Even the very first dungeon is a giant tree, and all these things force you to pay attention to that sneaky Z-axis.
With all the items and riddles in an adventure game, it can get quite complicated, but when you find a skull key, you know it goes in the skull door. And they've kept things simple by relying on symbology and color coding to give the world consistency.
Similarly, different sections of the world will follow different themes. Your travels will take you past the Forest Realm, the mountainous Goron Kingdom, the watery Zora's Domain, and each with their respective forest, fire, and water temples. The sandy land of Ganondorf also has its respective spirit temple. And at the end, when you assault the final tower, it's all the elements combined in an epic finale.
Each one of these temples gives you an item you'll use in the next, and the yellow C buttons will bring these items out. As a boy, you'll make use of the standard slingshot, bombs, and boomerang, but as you might expect, as an adult, it gets cooler. The bow and arrow is simple but fun, especially for horse archery. The all-new hookshot can help you reach those tricky places, and the lens of truth reveals the hidden.
Those are just some of the new items, and each temple's puzzles fit into their own theme and make great use of the appropriate items. Some of these puzzles can take you days to solve, but take our advice and don't look the answer up. Finishing this game all by yourself is a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Of course, it can take quite a few hours. When this game came out, we had a lot of time on our hands, but we're all grown up now, so you might want to think about committing a weekend or something.
That's right, but so many things are done for the first time in the game. Just one example would be moving around the statues and reflecting light onto the right places in the Spirit Temple, which pretty much every action game has emulated since.
And it's not like the graphics are that old, it still looks great, and it's a very playable game.
Yeah, and Super Mario 64 may have ushered in the 3D era, but this is like the foundation of games today. You know, playing games nowadays is like, oh yeah, they got that from Ocarina. Oh yeah, that was an Ocarina too.
That's true, Junk. So many games have borrowed from it, but few have actually done it better than Ocarina of Time. And I'm including all the other Zelda games in that too. And so it's an easy 10 out of 10 rubber chickens from me.
It's the greatest game of all time. It's Miyamoto's masterpiece. And to be honest, if you want to call yourself a gamer, you need to have played it. I wish I could give it more than 10 out of 10 rubber chickens.
You could give it 11.
Can I? Can I do that? Can I do that?
Good game.
Okay, it's backwards compatible time, Junk, but we've got just one problem.
I know, Badge. So much stuff happened in the games industry in the 90s, it's going to be impossible to cover it all.
True, but we do have to try, so let's kick it off with 1990. In the two preceding decades, we'd seen the birth, boom, and then the bust of the video games industry. But by 1990, gaming was back in the black and bigger than ever before.
And it didn't get any better than the biggest game release of 1990, Super Mario Bros. 3 for the NES. The third outing for Nintendo's dungaree-wearing plumber took him back to the Mushroom Kingdom, but this time there were more levels to conquer, more costumes to collect, and more Koopas to crush, and it was brilliant.
For its time, Mario 3 was one of the highest-selling games of all time, and for 8-bit Mario thrills, you still can't beat it.
Speaking of beat it, do you remember the last time Michael Jackson was cool?
I do, Jung. It was the 90s, and in 1990, he had two of the smoothest video games of the decade to his name, both called Moonwalker. While the two versions were very different, they both saw you controlling the gloved one as he danced his way through levels based on many of his best-known film clips, with your aim being to rescue a number of impressionable young children.
Moonwalker came out both in the arcades and on this thing. It's the Sega Mega Drive, and although it had been around for a while in its native Japan, it would take until 1990 for it to hit the rest of the world. You had one of these, didn't you, Bet?
I did, Jung. In fact, in the early to mid-90s, you were one of two things. You were either a Sega man or a Nintendo man, and I was a Sega man. The Mega Drive started out with a lot of old arcade ports like Altered Beast. But it quickly built itself a game library packed full of awesomeness, including a few of my personal favorites like Echo the Dolphin, Another World, and Virtual Racing.
As good a start as 1990 was, things got even better in 1991. Capcom's Street Fighter II came out in the arcades, sparking a coin-operated quarter-circle kicking craze that took every milk bar in the world by storm.
Sid Meier's Civilization series also began its long history in 1991, introducing the world to the empire-building strategy that still dominates the genre today. But what 1991 will really be remembered for is the beginning of gaming's highest profile feud, an epic rivalry the likes of which may never be seen again in the pages of gaming history, a gargantuan grudge match that still burns white hot to this very day and will never, ever, ever end.
Mario vs. Sonic, right? That's right, both the first Sonic the Hedgehog game and the next Mario game, Super Mario World, released within a couple months of each other in 1991, sparking off a mascot battle that helped to further fuel the most brutal console war the games industry has ever seen.
But whichever side you chose, you were getting a great game. Sonic was lightning fast, and it shot by in a blur before your brain had time to compute how much fun you were having. And it also had one of the best game soundtracks ever, which we still can't get out of our heads all these years later.
Meanwhile, Super Mario World was the launch title for the brand new Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which finally made it out of Japan just in time for 1991. Mario World had a slower, more deliberate pace, with an emphasis on conquering an entire island and unlocking all of its many secrets, using a variety of super suits and a little dinosaur called Yoshi.
Over the next couple of years, even more great games came out. The fatalities flew thick and fast when the first Mortal Kombat came out in '92. The real-time strategy genre was birthed when Westwood Studios released Dune 2, The Battle for Arrakis. And the Nazis got a much-deserved taste of chain gun when id Software's groundbreaking Wolfenstein 3D introduced the world to first-person shooters.
In 1993, the next big thing from id Software would change the face of PC gaming forever. It was dark, slightly scary, and exhilarating to play. It was Doom. As a space marine stranded on a demon-infested Martian base, you had to wade through countless zombies, mutant freaks, and whatever the hell this thing is, to eventually get to hell itself to take on the all-powerful cyber demon. Doom really changed the way games were made in the 90s. It introduced the world to deathmatch, and it kicked off a first-person shooting boom that is still riding high today. However, one thing from 1993 that didn't catch on was this. It's called a 3DO, and it was manufactured by a variety of companies, including Panasonic and Sanyo. This one here was made by a company called Gold Star, and although the 3DO was hyped up to be the future of gaming, it really wasn't.
It was the games, wasn't it, John? The 3DO just didn't have them, and the ones it did have were really bad, like this one.
Ah, another visitor. Don't be afraid. Be terrified!
Which is probably one of the worst first-person shooters ever.
Thankfully, throughout the middle of the 90s, literally hundreds of good games were released.
Nintendo created one of the all-time best 2D platform adventure games with Super Metroid.
Blizzard Entertainment released the first Warcraft game, Orcs and Humans.
Earthworm Jim became a popular game character for all of about 20 minutes.
Squaresoft's Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI made a big splash in every part of the world, except Australia, since they were never released here.
Peter Molyneux took the God game to the Funhouse with Theme Park, and just way too many more to mention.
By 1995, the game was changing. Sega released their Saturn console early in the year, and the Sony PlayStation also made its debut.
Now, these two machines alone signify the greatest technological leap in home consoles.
They used CDs instead of cartridges, which not only gave developers a huge amount of space to work with, but it also slashed the production costs of making games.
And not only that, but these were the first consoles that were really designed from the start to specialize in 3D graphics, and as a result, games as we know it literally took on a whole new dimension.
The Saturn had games like Yu Suzuki's super technical 3D brawler, Virtua Fighter 2. As well as Nights into Dreams, a magical action game that took you into an imaginary world of dreams and nightmares.
Meanwhile, the PlayStation had the likes of button-mashing punch-fest Tekken, the techno-pumping futuristic hover racing of Wipeout, and the marsupial-themed platforming of Crash Bandicoot, and plenty more besides.
Unfortunately for the Saturn, the PlayStation was a fair bit more powerful, had far classier games, and most importantly had a way better marketing department, all things that contributed to the Saturn's untimely demise in 1998. Meanwhile, the PS1 thrived well into the next decade.
The other big console release for the mid-90s was this. It's the Nintendo 64.
Now, I played this bad boy more than anything else during the 90s. The N64 was more powerful and prettier than any of the other consoles, and it definitely had some jaw-droppingly classic games, like the bear and bird platforming antics of Banjo-Kazooie, the suave super spy shenanigans of James Bond and GoldenEye 007,
Super Mario 64, of course, which many people still believe to be the best console game ever made.
Here we go!
Let's not forget my favorite game ever, Badjo, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time.
The late 90s saw a massive explosion of brilliant and groundbreaking games.
In 96, the first graphical, massively multiplayer online game, Meridian 59.
As we heard earlier in the show, id Software's Quake brought online multiplayer to the masses by being the first game to include internet death matches right out of the box.
Resident Evil made us pee in our pants with a combination of fear and zombie love.
And the first Tomb Raider game inflated the profile of gaming heroines to ridiculous proportions.
By the end of the 90s, we'd played Half-Life and Counter-Strike, Diablo, StarCraft, Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, Soul Calibur, Planescape Torment, and just so many more. In fact, Badjo, I'm gonna make a big call here and say that the 90s is my favorite decade for gaming ever.
Well, this decade's not quite over yet, but I do have to agree with you, Jung. We've mentioned so many great games today, and we've still only scratched the surface, and I think that really says something about how good it was to be a gamer in the 90s.
So what was your best game of the 90s? We'd love to hear some of your memories from the era, and your thoughts on any of the games we've mentioned, and any we didn't.
Jump on the Good Game forums and give us your thoughts. The best 3 posters will earn themselves a Good Game shirt.
Good game.
You can't be serious.
So did you guess the game for this week? It was Mario's Tennis for the Nintendo Virtual Boy, an odd goggle-like console that attempted to immerse the player in virtual reality. Problem was, it only displayed one color, red.
Mario's Tennis was one of the few games to actually be released for the console before it was unceremoniously canned by Ninty, and it's actually a pretty good tennis game. Although because of the Virtual Boy's all-red screen, after a few sets you'd end up with a splitting headache.
Take 2 of these and tell me what's in next week's show.
Next week we return to the 21st century with all the latest games and gaming news from around the globe, including this year's trip to E3.
We hope you've enjoyed pinging the 90s with us. What a magnificent decade for games it was. Don't forget to hop on the Good Game forums and talk to the best damn gaming community in this decade. Till next time, gamers, Junglist out.
Badjo out.